So I'm very happy now to introduce Mary Poovey to you, and she will speak on the topic Stories We Tell about financial markets, from Victorian metaphors to modern models. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you all for coming. It's difficult to upstage this fabulous image, so I felt I had to get a little bit closer to it. If you can't hear me in the back, will you let me know, and then I'll move over to where the microphone is, because otherwise I'd rather be a little closer to the center of the stage than over there. I framed this lecture as a discussion of liberalism because I think that the concept of liberalism is a good way to connect the 19th century text I'm interested in with what's happening now. Now, as you probably know, liberalism and neoliberalism are extremely complicated concepts and words that no longer seem to mean the same thing as they once did, if they ever meant anything at all. So you'll just have to bear with me as I work my way back toward the concept of liberalism, which is the framing rubric of this lecture, although it is not the main topic of the lecture. The main topic of the lecture is the recent financial crisis, which I heard referred to the other day in Brisbane as the GFC. I didn't know the global financial crisis had been turned into an acronym, but I guess why not? In this lecture, I discussed two kinds of liberalism. In its classical or early form, which was articulated in 19th century Britain, Europe, and the US, liberalism highlighted individuals, their right to be free agents, own property, and exercise civil and political rights. In its neo form, which was elaborated mostly in the US and Britain after 1970, liberalism calls to account the corporatized political, social, and economic organizations that threaten to restrict another kind of freedom. The organizations that neoliberals target include the welfare state, all forms of big government, including what they see as excessive taxation, and anything that smacks of socialism, i.e. socialized medicine. What they want to liberate is the economy, largely, although not exclusively, by deregulating financial markets. Doing so, they argue, will allow the global economy to achieve its natural state of efficiency and individuals to profit freely from it. Now, oddly enough, in the United States these days, the group that's most closely associated with the ideas that I'm linking to neoliberalism detests the word liberal of any form, and that's a group known as the Tea Party. I hope you have at least heard of the Tea Party. Like every ideology, both forms of liberalism are organized by constitutive contradictions. In the 19th century, one of the contradictions that gave liberalism its distinctive form turned on exclusion. Despite liberals' emphasis on individual freedom, political entitlement, and personal autonomy, only some kinds of people, white, male, and European, got to be what Catherine Hall calls civilized subjects. One of the characteristic contradictions of neoliberalism, by contrast, involves the nature of individualism itself, or more precisely, the relationship between the individual agent and the dynamics of those larger systems in which individuals operate, especially the market. This contradiction follows from the potential tension between the two sites of agency this theory names. On the one hand, individuals are cast as autonomous agents with the potential for self-determination. On the other, the economy is supposedly self-governing as well, and its dynamics are theoretically both rational and efficient. The contradiction in classical liberalism became visible in the last quarter of the 20th century when feminist and post-colonial scholars pointed out the incoherence of a theory that declared everyone to be free while only allowing freedom to some groups. The contradiction in neoliberalism is now becoming visible as well, as people try to understand the financial crisis that erupted in 2007 and that continues to take its toll on economies and individuals across the globe. The contradictions of neoliberalism are now becoming visible in the tension between two kinds of stories people are telling about the financial crisis. On the one hand, these stories depict the market as an autonomous, self-organizing system that ought to have maintained equilibrium. On the other hand, they feature individuals who are presented as autonomous agents and who either caused or ought to have prevented the crisis. So Bernie Madoff is presented as the villain who caused everything to come tumbling down in the US, and Ben Bernanke is depicted as the person who ought to have been able to keep things going. The most rigorous versions of the first kind of story, the kind of story that emphasizes the autonomy of the market, are embedded in the theorems generated by academic economists. Now, these economists are often called neoliberal economists, so just keep that phrase in mind. These theorems include portfolio theory, the efficient market hypothesis, and the options pricing model. All that you need to know about them is that they are typically expressed mathematically, and they seek to model the relationships among numerous market factors so that financial professionals can help manage uncertainty or risk. The second kind of story centers on particular individuals who either helped create the equations that dominate modern finance or worked within the financial institutions that rose to prominence in the last half-century. Such narratives have poured from the business and popular press since the financial crisis began. All of these books are organized around individual stories, and they seek to make their heroes or villains come vividly alive for the reader. There was a point fairly early in the financial crisis in which I said I was going to read everything that came out of the press about what was happening in the world of finance, right? You got it. My apartment is now stacks of books up to about here, almost all of which are unread. They rapidly threaten to overwhelm me and all the space that I have in New York City. These two kinds of narratives, the account implicit in the neoclassical theorization of an autonomous, self-regulating market, and the stories of individual actors, pull in different directions. One asserts that no matter what individuals do, the financial market as a whole will achieve equilibrium. The other assumes that individuals have agency and can operate freely within complex systems, including the market. In this lecture, I turn to 19th century liberalism to show both that the tensions inherent in neoliberalism can also be found in its classical version, and that neoliberalism has transformed its predecessor in some very alarming ways. I argue that both liberalisms rest upon an underlying metaphor, but for reasons that involve specific historical developments, the metaphor that informed classical liberalism was displaced in the 20th century by another metaphor, which functioned not as a figure of speech, but as a model. As the metaphor that informs neoliberalism began to be operationalized through tools that literally brought this metaphor to life, the model people used to simulate the economy and to manage uncertainty began to affect the way the financial market worked to generate uncertainty. In the fall of 2007, because the model had taken on a life of its own, and because it had diverged so widely from what it claimed to represent, the world was pushed to the brink of financial ruin. Neoliberals tell two stories about the financial crisis because they have forgotten something our Victorian predecessors knew very well. This something is the subject of my remarks today. I begin with John Stuart Mill, the British philosopher and political economist, because he articulated for his generation the principles of both classical liberalism and political economy, the 19th century predecessor of economics. In his seminal defense of liberalism, called On Liberty, Mill placed individual agency squarely at the center of modern society. Quote, "Whatever crushes individuality is despotism," end quote, he wrote. Even though Mill emphatically endorsed individualism and implied that individuals could and should be free agents, he also realized that individuals both belong to larger groups and sometimes need to be studied as parts of what he variously called the collective body, the collective character, the social body, and the social organism. This last phrase reveals that the metaphor that underwrote Mill's understanding of social groups and social systems was an organic one. Even though the metaphor was organic, Mill knew that the science his contemporary used to examine the collective body could not attain the rigor achieved by the sciences that use the experimental method, like physics. The method that Mill calls social statics, which he described in the 6th book of his System of Logic, had to rely on philosophical deduction and historical observation because no artificial experiments were possible in the study of the social body. So Mill knew that a rigorous science had to use experiments. He also knew that you couldn't do experiments on the social collective. So the sciences that he lumped together as social statics had to have other methodologies to compensate for the fact that they couldn't run experiments. In his Principles of Political Economy, we see that deduction and historical observation, which are at the heart of social statics, inform political economy as well. We also see how Mill used the foundational metaphor of the organism to compensate for the relative immaturity of political economy. Now, he used that word immaturity to refer to those sciences which did not yet have the experimental method. That's his word, immaturity. So here is Mill on the subject of commercial crises. The most recent commercial crisis in Britain occurred just as John Stuart Mill was writing the Principles of Political Economy. And as I read this, you should listen for the anticipations of the financial crisis we've just been through. In certain states of the public mind, examples of rapid increase of fortune call forth numerous imitators, and speculation not only goes much beyond what is justified by the original grounds for expecting a rise in price, but extends itself to articles in which there never was any such ground. These, however, rise like the rest as soon as speculation sets in. So think of housing prices in 2005. As the price of housing in the US began to rise, then in imitation of the increase in housing, increases in the price of houses, the increase of other kinds of commodities related to housing began to rise. Not only do all whom, at periods of this kind, a great expansion of credit takes place. So again, think of the housing situation in the US in which banks began to lend money for mortgages. This is a great expansion of credit to anybody who presented themselves at the door, no matter whether they had good credit ratings, no matter whether they even had a job. Okay. Now, not only do all whom the contagion reaches employ their credit much more freely than usual, buying second homes, taking out second mortgages, using their houses like an ATM machine to buy boats, and so on, but they really have more credit because the banks are willing to lend them more money, because they seem to be making unusual gains because the price of their houses seems to be going up. Sorry, I am interpolating here. Mill didn't include all this part about housing. You realize that, of course. And because a generally reckless and adventurous feeling prevails, which disposes people to give as well as take credit, more largely than at other times, and give it to persons not entitled to it. Those people without incomes who show up at the bank and say, hey, I'd like to buy that $400,000 house down the road. I'm sure you'll give me a mortgage. And the bank says, yes, of course we'll give you a mortgage. When, after such a rise, the reaction comes and prices begin to fall, speculative purchases cease, and to the rational desire not to overextend one's credit, there is superadded, in extreme cases, a panic, as unreasoning as the previous overconfidence, which is what happened when the price of houses began to fall, and then suddenly nobody could sell their houses. Money is borrowed for short periods at almost any rate of interest, which is what Bear Stearns did as it began to try to save itself from its bad debts coming due. And sales of good for immediate payment are made at almost any sacrifice. Thus, general prices during a commercial revulsion fall as much below the usual level as during the previous period of speculation they have risen above it. The fall as well as the rise originating not in anything affecting money, but in the state of credit, end quote. In this paragraph, Mill refers to two kinds of agents, and he uses a variant of the organic metaphor, in this case the trope of contagion, to connect them to each other. The first kind of agent consists of individuals, merchants and traders, and the second includes abstractions that convey collectivities, the public mind. Okay? In Mill's account, what unites individuals into a public mind and causes both speculation and panic to spread within it can only be conjured metaphorically. Contagion, a metaphor taken from the miasmatic theory of disease transmission, suggests the rapidity with which cholera, for example, spread throughout 19th century communities. The trope of contagion is neither exact nor definitive, but because Mill held only modest expectations about the rigor that non-experimental social sciences could attain, he did not insist that the metaphors that underwrote them be anything other than that, figures that captured some likeness without being amenable to any kind of proof. So John Stuart Mill was perfectly happy to use metaphors to convey something about what he was talking about, because he knew the social sciences couldn't attain the rigor of an experimental science. To show you how the organic metaphor that informed 19th century political economy was displaced by another trope, and how Mill's modest ambitions for the social sciences were replaced by a far greater ambition for the science that political economy became, I need briefly to rehearse some of the historical developments that led liberalism to morph into its 20th century counterpart. To some of you, this summary history is going to be familiar. To others, it may be new. In either case, bear with me. For at the heart of this narrative lies the conjunction of military planning, computer-driven mathematical modeling, scientific management, and economic theory that helps explain both neoliberalism's inherent contradiction and the origins of the recent financial crisis. So what I'm now about to give you is a history which is admittedly truncated that will connect Mill's 19th century social sciences with economics in the 20th century. For the entire 19th century, Britain dominated the global financial system. This was possible because most other nations in the West had agreed to adopt the gold standard, and because London supplied most of the world's credit. When World War I disrupted international credit flows, and in the chaos of the interwar years, the gold standard collapsed in 1931, and individual nations began to adopt isolationist policies. During the 1930s, it is also the case that economics, the discipline of economics, remained a relatively immature science, that's using Mill's phrase. While economics had become a university discipline in many countries, economists did not share a single theoretical vocabulary, and they did not agree about the best way to understand the global financial system, or whether it even made sense to talk about markets and finance in terms of global interconnectedness. To use the terms I've just applied to Mill, economists lacked a unifying metaphor. When one economic theory did push its rivals aside, beginning in the 1940s, the metaphor that triumphed came from physics, by way of the military deployment of scientific expertise. Both during and after World War II, this deployment was organized by a non-academic mathematical enterprise called operations research, or OR. The links between what became economic orthodoxy in the 1970s and OR during and in the decades after World War II are complex. But as Philip Moralski tells this story in a really wonderful book called Machine Dreams, you're all nodding your head back there, you've all read Machine Dreams, right? Neoclassical economic theory was an amalgamation of three schools of economic thought, which were developed respectively at the University of Chicago, in the Extramural Cowles Commission, and at MIT. Miralski argues that contributors to all three economic schools had ties to operations research and the institutions in which this work continued after the war ended. The differences among these three schools are less important to this story than are their shared roots in operations research and the way they eventually fused. Operations research, which was originally developed in Britain, then imported to the US in the early 1940s, uses mathematical modeling to produce optimal solutions to complex problems, like how to coordinate command, control, communication, and the deployment of weapons in a military situation. Basically, OR looks for quantifiable variables in a phenomenon or system which is assumed to be closed. So I'm now giving you the basic assumptions of operations research. So the first assumption is you have to assume that the system is closed. OR then posits a simple as-if function for the phenomenon under investigation so that data can be collected on the derivatives of this function. So you say it is as if these things are connected to each other, and then you work to collect data on the derivatives of that particular relation. OR then scales up from individual instances to larger units. So if this connects to that at a small unit, then the theory is that you can scale up to that, scale up from that to the system as a whole. And then OR uses statistics to address any lingering uncertainties and unknowns in the problem. So if the scaling up leaves an area of uncertainty, then probabilistic statistics is used to account for what you can't actually observe. During the war, this technique was used to manage and deploy air, ground, and sea resources by treating combat as a problem in logic. Okay, treating combat as a problem in logic. After the war, those trained in OR began to treat politics and the economy as logic problems too. And in the work of John von Neumann and others, the strategies of OR were expanded to include game theory, mathematical formalization, systems analysis, linear programming, and computational innovations. Most importantly, von Neumann promoted the computer as both tool and exemplar of organizational rationalization. The mathematicized economic theory that emerged from these OR roots assumed that logical systems like the market work if unimpeded, that the rationality individuals exhibit in economic behavior is algorithmic, and that computer programs can simulate or model this rationality. Now, for me, the critical assumption there is that human behavior is algorithmic and therefore can be mathematically modeled. The OR-inspired developments within the academic discipline of economics began to filter into the curricula of business schools in the 1970s, when business schools began to hire more economists to staff their faculties. So you can't just go from the ideas in OR to economic theory. You have to figure out how that particular set of ideas got taught. And they got taught in the US context in business schools, which had been mandated by a government-sponsored report to hire more economists, okay? So that's how OR got into the curricula of business schools. Many US business schools were already primed to embrace the assumptions and methods of OR-influenced economic theory because their professors were already teaching management as a science devoted to analyzing complex organizations and systems. So another piece of this, management was a science before economics was a science. Okay. Von Neumann's promotion of the computer as tool and exemplar of operations research hints at the metaphor that underwrites this complex nexus of military planning, scientific management, and neoclassical economic theory. Over the middle decades of the 20th century, various theorists have offered numerous formulations that hint at this metaphor: cybernetics, information, organized complexity, algorithmic rationality. Those are all terms that people have used to try to capture this metaphor. Whatever term we settle on, I personally prefer cybernetics. The metaphor invokes an analytic method that simulates reality. This analytic method is characterized by the use of formal logic, mathematical formalization, game theory, and systems analysis. And it treats the complex phenomenon it analyzes as a closed system whose components interact with each other in complex ways, including feedback mechanisms, as they tend toward equilibrium. For the moment, we must leave open the question of whether this analytic method, which simulates reality, must assume that the phenomenon it analyzes is also characterized by algorithmic rationality, or whether the model the analysts construct is only a model. Now, Donald McKenzie captures this question by asking whether financial models function as a camera or an engine, whether they just take a picture of something that's really there or whether they actually drive something. So I'm just going to suspend that question for a moment. The naturalization of the neoclassical model of the economy. So by naturalization, I here want to talk about the social process by which people began to take for granted that this description of the economy was accurate. Okay, so that's what I'm calling naturalization. The naturalization of the neoclassical model of the economy was facilitated by 4 related developments in the 1970s. First, finance began to replace industry and production as the leading source of economic growth in the West. So there are all kinds of metrics that show that income from capital gains and other financial instruments now exceeds the profits of industry and production in the U.S. Second, economic theorists and professors of finance embraced a new paradigm for investment management called portfolio theory. Now, I'm going to explain in a minute why that matters. Third, in 1974, the U.S. government passed the Employee Retirement Insurance Security Act, called ERISA, short name of ERISA. I'm going to tell you what ERISA is in a minute and explain why that's so important. And fourth, financial analysts emerged as an influential professional group. These events were related to each other in the following way. ERISA, that piece of legislation, which was intended to protect workers against the ruinous effects of corporate bankruptcy, required companies to set money aside to fund retirements. Previous to the passage of ERISA, companies had set up pension schemes for their employees, and basically the companies made the investment decisions about those pension schemes. But ERISA was a federal mandate that the companies set up these huge investment funds, and they passed the decision-making mandate along to the individual investors. So people like me were suddenly required to decide what to do with our investment funds, to our retirement funds, and people like me had no clue about what to do about it. Thus in steps the financial advisor. Okay, so the first thing that happened in the wake of the passage of ERISA was that huge pools of assets were produced, and these pools of assets, according to the provisions of ERISA, had to be managed according to the industry's best standards. The financial industry adopted a theory called portfolio theory as its best standard. And because this theory, which prices risk at the level of the portfolio as a whole instead of in terms of individual stocks, was more complicated than picking individual stocks, individuals and institutions increasingly sought investment help. And a professionalized group of money managers presented its members as better trained to satisfy the standards of their industry because they could apply portfolio theory. Now, this is like a chain of causes and effects. The government passes ERISA. ERISA leads to the accumulation of huge pools of money that have to be invested. According to the terms of ERISA, they have to be invested in what the financial industry declares to be its best standards. The financial industry declares its best standards to be portfolio theory. Portfolio theory is so complicated because it prices risk at the level of the portfolio as a whole that individual people like me don't have a clue about what decisions to make. And so we turn to people who can help us make these decisions. A whole new professional group called financial advisors emerges to help people like me make those decisions. Professional managers fared better than individual investors because once the industry identified the portfolio as the most important site of risk, it became important to figure asset diversification, covariance, risk, and inflation into investment strategies. Calculating these factors requires the kind of sophisticated mathematical tools and modeling favored by OR, which use computer programs to figure how all of them work together to affect the movement of the stocks contained within the portfolio. If you go to an investment advisor or a financial advisor in the US right now, they will use the formula that someone elsewhere in their organization has worked up to mathematically relate the covariance and risk factors involved in your portfolio. It's highly likely that your financial advisor will not know what the algorithms are, nor will they understand how they work. These algorithms are by and large black boxed. They are simply inside, unavailable to the person who deploys them. What you are buying when you go to a financial advisor in the US right now is expertise that financial advisor does not have. It's outsourced elsewhere in the company, whether it's Merrill Lynch or Bear Stearns or whoever. The combination of an economic shift from production to finance, a mathematically expressed investment theory, the legal requirement in the US that a huge volume of assets be channeled into managed funds, and the availability of a group of business school trained professionals who could implement the theoretical claims of economists helped neoclassical economic theory become orthodoxy during the 1970s. These events also helped make both the underlying metaphor of cybernetics seem like an accurate description of economic reality and economics, the most powerful of all the social sciences. Now, there were a series of laws passed in the 1970s under Reagan and Thatcher that further made neoclassical economic theory seem true, and these included a whole series of law that deregulated banking, including the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been passed in the 1930s, and which had kept the investment function of a financial industry separate from the banking function of that industry. So that was repealed. By the end of the 1970s, the neoclassical model of the financial system as autonomous, efficient, and rational had come to seem like a self-evident truth. As it did so, the metaphor that underwrote the model ceased to function as a metaphor because financial professionals treated it as an accurate description of the system it supposedly modeled. What was initially a metaphor for economists, in other words, was actualized in the real world because the model and the tool, the computer, that operationalized this metaphor were so widely used by professional investors who were in charge of ever greater pools of capital. As professional investors and financial advisors became convinced that the theory of value that informed neoclassical economic theory was useful, these investors bought and sold with this theory in mind, and as they did so, the theory was transmitted into prices. These prices might seem to express facts about an autonomous market and the tendency of prices to reflect all the information that is available, but they actually reflect only the model of value the investors use. While this point may seem like a theoretical critique mounted by a literary post-structuralist, it is actually a commonplace within the financial community. One of the most enthusiastic historians of modern economics, Peter L. Bernstein, acknowledges the reflexive relationship that links economic theory to the dynamics of financial markets. Now, quoting Bernstein, quote, "It may sound ironic, but as investors increasingly draw upon the assumptions of neoclassical economics to shape their strategies, to innovate new financial instruments, and to motivate the drive for higher returns in relation to risk, the real world is on a path toward an increasing resemblance to this theoretical model." So you hear what he's saying. He's saying that the reflexive relationship between the model and the market is making the market resemble the model that's being implemented. We can explain the success of the cybernetic model both by noting that it was compatible with the way that economists understood their theoretical work as scientific, and by recognizing that it gave intellectual credibility and an expressly financial content to OR-influenced financial managers who had also begun to identify themselves as members of a professional group in the 1970s. So we have an overlap of the professionalizing impulse of these two groups and their desire to seem like scientists, okay? The overlap between the self-interested agendas of these two groups, academic economists and financial managers, went largely unnoticed during the 1970s and for much of the 1980s because the promoters of this model presented it as simply descriptive. According to its champions, it is simply true that market prices contain perfect, that is to say comprehensive, information, and that they fluctuate randomly, that is to say independently of each other. In 1987, this changed abruptly when a computerized trading program designed to help professional investors minimize risk triggered a huge sell-off on Wall Street. On October 19th of that year, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 508 points. At 23%, this represented the worst single day in the history of the U.S. financial market. The collapse was sparked by traders' use of a software program which priced portfolio insurance, which was created and marketed by a company called Leland O'Brien Rubenstein, or LOR. In 1987, LOR directly managed $5 billion in employee pension funds. Other money managers who had licensed this proprietary software controlled an additional $45 billion, so $50 billion was being managed by this one software program. The program was intended to protect clients' portfolios during a down market, but because the LOR program was keyed to the pervasive forces of the market, it was inevitable that a sufficiently large number of positions, hedged according to the same algorithm, would affect the market. On October 19th, this is exactly what happened. The trading model directed fund managers to sell, and when they all tried to dump stock at the same time, the Dow plummeted. Now, since then, U.S. regulators have outlawed portfolio insurance, but they haven't interrogated or outlawed the risk model that LOR software was using. And even the financial legislation that was just passed under the Obama administration does not outlaw the use of these particular risk models, or indeed any risk models. Another version of this dynamic helped spark the financial crisis that began to unfold in 2007. Once again, computer-driven models and the products based on these models played a significant role in these developments. Once more again, the models were deployed in such a way as to influence the market they were theoretically supposed to describe. This time, the products involved were not simply software programs like LOR's portfolio pricing program, but an entire array of structured investment products, including various kinds of derivatives, credit default swaps, those are insurance contracts created to insure against the default on structured investment products like derivatives, and assorted synthetic securities, many of which are simply mathematically generated. That is to say, there is no underlying real asset. One kind of derivative, the kind that sparked the crisis, consisted of mortgage-backed securities, groups of mortgages that individual analysts had bundled together, then metaphorically sliced into tranches that carried different degrees of risk and different rates of return. Individual mortgages had historically offered little appeal to investors because borrowers could pay them off at any time. But when offered as slices of a computer-generated product composed of parts of numerous mortgage debts, derivatives based on mortgages offered precisely the kind of risk-specific investment opportunity that large-scale investors had begun to seek. And if you read books about this, like The Big Short by Michael Lewis, it seems that these big investment banks were barely able to create enough of these structured products to sell to the investing communities that were desperate to get the products. If the model that investment professionals were using had been accurate, as they assumed it was, the combination of risk distributing strategies and structured investment products might well have created the market perfection postulated by a neoclassical theory. Because an infinite number and kind of derivatives could be created in this largely unregulated global market for financial instruments, in other words, risk could theoretically have been distributed so widely at such tolerable levels and to parties willing to incur so many levels of risk that equilibrium would have been produced in the worldwide financial market. But as we now know, this is not what happened. because the model investors were using was not an accurate reflection of the real world, but only a model that could simulate, not mirror, the behaviors of people, kinds and degrees of risk, and fluctuations in the real estate market. For mortgage-backed securities to have continued to fuel both the credit of hundreds of thousands of consumers and the voracious appetite of institutional investors, the value of the underlying assets, that is to say the houses, and the number of mortgage purchasers would have had to continue to increase forever. In fact, the models that were being used factored in an annual increase in housing prices of 6 to 7% forever. So that meant, as far as anyone could see into the future, the model said the value of prices would continue to go up. Once oversupply glutted regional housing markets, however, prices stabilized, then they didn't go up anymore, then they began to fall. And as mortgage rates began to reset, because a lot of mortgage sellers had been using teaser introductory rates, which were artificially set low, as mortgage rates began to reset, homeowners began defaulting on their loans, which the models never allowed for. As the number of defaults increased, the assets from which some of even the most highly rated derivatives took their value turned out to be worth less than just plain worthless. The claims against credit default swaps multiplied, and some of the world's most venerable investment banks found it impossible to borrow money. In the fall of 2007, in a domino effect made up of cascading defaults, revelations about balance sheets riddled with toxic assets, and desperate governments' ineffectual attempts to intervene, investment banks began to falter, Lehman Brothers fell, global flows of credit froze, and previous prosperous companies, even some national governments like Iceland, were forced to declare insolvency. At this point, let me summarize the theoretical point I'm making. Then I'll turn very briefly to the contradiction in neoliberalism that stories about the financial crisis have exposed. My theoretical point concerns the difference between a metaphor and a model, or more precisely, the difference between knowing that a metaphor is merely a figure of speech and treating the model derived from it as if it were descriptive or an accurate picture of reality. A metaphor, as Aristotle defined it, assigns a name or quality of one thing to something else, to which this name or quality does not properly belong. The function of a metaphor, as part of rhetoric, is to enhance discourse and spark imaginative thinking in a mode indifferent to induction and deduction. The function of a metaphor in sociological terms is to help create methodological and theoretical consensus among competing factions of an enterprise so that what is initially an immature because contentious practice can elicit the agreement among its practitioners necessary for the group to achieve professional recognition and social prestige. That's why it's so important for a political campaign to agree upon a single metaphor that will organize its enterprise. When the Obama campaign adopted the metaphor, "Yes, we can," other groups began to coalesce around that phrase. Now, as far as I can tell, what's going on in your politics right now, they don't got a metaphor. Leaks, they got. A model, by contrast, is typically informed by one metaphor or group of metaphors. Indeed, model is a metaphor when it is used to apply to a second-order representation, as in mathematical model or options pricing model. The analytic function of a model is to simulate some real-world phenomenon. Generally, a model simplifies, it simplifies real-world complexities by eliminating variables deemed irrelevant or by freezing the phenomenon in time. One can reflect self-consciously upon the way a model idealizes, that is to say, departs from conditions in the real world and adjusts the model accordingly, as Newton did in his Principia. But as long as the phenomenon being modeled exists in time and space, no static model can capture it in all its complexity. The methodological advantage of a model is that one can perform experiments on or with it in ways that are impossible with actual phenomenon, especially social phenomena like societies or financial markets. While these experiments may help the analyst understand the phenomenon under investigation, they will not change that phenomenon in the real world. As we've just seen, however, in some circumstances, treating a model as if it were an accurate reflection of what it claims to describe can actually make the model real. In these circumstances, the model becomes performative. It actualizes the assumptions that inform it. It literalizes its foundational metaphor. But as we have also seen, the performative capacities of models is inherently limited, especially when the model simulates a social phenomenon. If a model's informing assumptions do not correspond to the real conditions it purports to describe, then the reality that widespread use of the model creates will eventually collapse as the discrepancy between the model and the phenomenon it misrepresents widen. So as soon as it became clear that housing prices were not going to rise at 6 to 7% annually, the gap between the model that was being used and the underlying reality was exposed. This should explain the title of this talk. I'm not arguing that the organic metaphor is necessarily a better figure for society than cybernetics, or that the immature 19th century social sciences were superior to their modern, supposedly mature, because mathematical counterparts. Instead, I'm arguing that Victorians realized that the foundational metaphors of political economy were just that, metaphors, which could spark thought but not prove hypotheses. John Stuart Mill and most of the other Victorians who used organic metaphors realized that approximations and generalizations were as close as they could get to accuracy. Many modern economists, by contrast, along with most financial analysts and institutional investors, treat their models as accurate reflections of the economy. They have come to believe that economics not only resembles, but actually is a science, like physics. They have forgotten the as-if clause that governs the relationship between the model and the phenomenon. The hedge fund manager George Soros summarized these fallacies in the afterword to his 2008 book on the financial crisis. Now quoting George Soros, quote, "The prevailing paradigm asserts that financial markets tend toward equilibrium. While it is possible to construct theoretical models along these lines, the claim that these models apply to the real world is both false and misleading," end quote. Let me return at last to the tension I initially identified between the theorems set out by neoclassical economic theory with their underlying metaphor of anti-individualistic cybernetics and the individualized stories that journalists and market participants have been telling about the financial crisis. I'll just make two simple points about this tension. First, I think that the success of individualized stories expresses nostalgia for precisely the kind of individual agency, the kind of individuality that a society permeated by computerized, information harvesting software programs and digital algorithms renders impossible. I think that people prefer stories about individual heroes and villains to complex accounts of institutions and computer models for the same reason they flock to social networking sites like Facebook. They are trying to reclaim a kind of individualism that is no longer possible, if it ever was. By imagining that some individuals caused or could be held responsible for the financial crisis, we imagine that we could be agents too. By trying to reclaim not just the computer metaphor, but the computer tool as well, we try to reinsert ourselves into a digital universe that increasingly does resemble the model OR-influenced economists devised. You know, when you put a Hello Kitty on your iPhone, try to make it your own, like personalized, just like me. Not that any of you would use Hello Kitty. This may be the ultimate irony as individual users attempt to make the cybernetic universe our own, to tailor it to meet personal needs. We allow ourselves to be reduced to data points or parts of data points, more useful to some global corporation than expressive of anything like individuality. Finally, let me point out what to some of you must be obvious. You don't have to contrast neoclassical theories to stories about individual hubris to find a tension between cybernetic thinking and individualism. For neoclassical economic theory already contains this tension in the paradoxical relationship between the self-interested individual and the well-being of society as a whole. For Adam Smith, Another founder of classical liberalism, it was not clear why numerous individuals, all seeking only to better themselves, inadvertently enhance the well-being of the nation. He resolved this paradox, or more precisely, he displaced it, with another metaphor, the trope of the invisible hand. Modern neoclassical economists, by contrast, have generally abandoned the metaphor of the invisible hand, and along with it, Smith's modest admission that no one understands how or even if individual self-interest really does improve society as a whole. Instead, by asserting that economic theories are both scientific and accurate, many modern economists mask what it takes to square the dream of individual agency with a market conceptualized cybernetically in terms of algorithmic rationality. In order to claim that individuals are free agents in this cybernetic economy, economists have to treat every individual as an instance of economic man. They have to declare any motivation that cannot be distilled to self-interest irrelevant. They have to isolate features that can be quantified and functions whose derivatives can be modeled. In such a representation, which claims to be accurate, everything that might be said to preserve the individuality of the individual, his body, her fantasies, his dreams, her style, is declared unimportant. Such old-fashioned, individualizing qualities find no place in this cybernetic universe, except, of course, in the ephemera of culture, in the pages of novels and poems, on canvases and on the stages where actors perform our lives. Thank you.